Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session. My name is Sharissa Wu, and I'm a program assistant at the US Asia Institute. USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 46-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is the latest installment of our Southeast Asia in Focus webinar series, which offers unique insights into this very dynamic region. Today, our webinar is titled Rising Tides Protest in Southeast Asia, which will discuss recent citizen protests across the region. So for today's discussion, each of our speakers will first deliver some remarks on the topic, and then after the remarks, we will have a Q&A moderated by one of our panelists, Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran. Please feel free to type any questions in the chat function as they arise, as we will address them following the speaker remarks. So joining our panel today are Dr. Meredith Weiss, Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, and Dr. Julio Teehankee. So first, Dr. Meredith Weiss received her master's and PhD in political science from Yale University and is a professor of political science at the University of Albany. She's also the director of the SUNY/CUNY Southeast Asia Consortium, which aims to provide understanding to promote research and teaching efforts around Southeast Asia in New York's public universities. Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran received his master's and PhD focusing on international relations, international business, and U.S. foreign policy from Tufts University. He is the founder of the ASEAN Wonk newsletter and is a visiting scholar at American University's ASEAN and Indo-Pacific Studies Initiative. And finally, Dr. Julio Teehankee received his master's in political science from the University of the Philippines and his PhD in development studies from De La Salle University, where he is also currently a professor. He is also the host of his own YouTube channel titled Talk Politics with Julio Teehankee. So welcome again to all of our panelists, and thank you so much for being here to share your expertise with us. I think we can get started. So I'll now turn the floor over to Dr. Weiss to deliver some remarks on the topic.
Thanks. It's nice to be here. It's a pretty broad topic. So what I've tried to narrow it down to are kind of three overarching phenomena that are in effect simultaneously. None of these is unique to Southeast Asia, but all are especially visible there. So I will be quite brief and then turn things over to my co-panelists and Q&A. So the first is the phenomenon, what we have all seen in so many contexts of Gen Z or youth protests, which we see throughout Southeast Asia and the wider Asian context, but also everywhere else. So this has to do with activism that engages with a wider range of issues and categories. That's really rising even as democracy in so many places seems insufficiently responsive or accountable, or in places like Myanmar and Thailand, where we have just full stop authoritarian retrenchment. This trend within activism is different from youth protest previously. I have a edited volume that's in press now with a whole bunch of young, energetic Southeast Asian and East Asian contributors that explores this in detail. But some of the things that we have seen include, for instance, a much greater involvement of young women, much more visible LGBTQ plus engagement, and also just a wider range of issues that are being tied in with overarching themes of, say, democracy. A lot of what distinguishes this protest, particularly in Asia, but also more broadly as well, has to do with what's termed intra-Asia. Sometimes people say inter-Asia, but it's really intra-Asia or global referencing that looks beyond sort of Western tropes in many cases. So tremendous influence from K-pop and Hallyu broadly, the Korean wave, things like Boys Love or BL as sort of memifications that are used within these protests. The One Piece pirate flag, which we're seeing in places like Indonesia, but also apparently in France. And then not Asian, but the Hunger Games as also a Hollywood theme that has transmuted across all of Southeast Asia. Some of the issues that arise in this vein, really promoted by youth activism, are things like linking broader political issues domestically to climate change, um, finding new twists on anti-imperial or anti-imperialist or anti-colonial, anti-neocolonial themes, issues such as Gaza as being a big mobilizer of youth throughout the region, and so forth. A second key issue, and again, all of these frames interlace in complex ways, has to do with increasing awareness of and or mobilization around socioeconomic class. And this is distinctive in a region in which, in many countries, ethnicity or other divisions have been really dominant in shaping political mobilization, both informal and formal politics for a long time. So these are issues of corruption, of elite entitlement, and inequality, especially as members of an aspiring middle class, especially youth, see less chance of social mobility, home ownership, rising to the level of their parents, maintaining that level if they are the parents, and so forth. A lot of this activism, which is not just among youth, but also includes a lot of, those who are really precariously trying to develop their economic and lives now, is really an artifact of deindustrialization in much of the region, a rising service industry, and specifically the gig economy, coupled with extremely deep and obvious inequality and exacerbated by the lingering effects socioeconomically of the pandemic. We see very, very similar protests in Nepal and Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh and South Asia that have had dramatic and regime changing effects. And those protests echo so closely and have been so close in time to those in places like Indonesia and the Philippines that we might well wonder the extent of demonstration effects. Um, in Indonesia, we saw massive protests that turned quite violent over issues, especially of allowances for housing granted to members of parliament. That set of issues also ended up touching ever more substantially on issues of gig workers' precarity, especially after a police car killed a ride-hailing driver. These protests extended throughout various cities across Indonesia, resulted in the torching of regional legislatures and other government buildings, the looting very dramatically of politicians' homes, at least 7 deaths, possibly more, and well over 1,000 people arrested. In the Philippines, right around the same time, we saw massive protests, which Julio Teehankee might touch on, over corruption, especially over graft and flood control funds, which had to do with both politicians and contractors, um, mismanaged contracts coming at the same time as increasingly extreme weather, and long recognized extents of just corruption in especially government contracts. And Timor-Leste as well, where we have not seen as many protests large enough to be covered by international media, though there has been youth unrest, especially around university students as claimants. We saw recently very similarly motivated protests over the extent of spending on cars for members of parliament. In Malaysia, a procurement bill passed, which most would recognize as a good thing, except that it was done in such an untransparent, hasty way within 1 week of being tabled, that sparked protests as well. Linked with some other protests around socioeconomic issues and corruption, which much of this really stretches back to the earlier days of the 1MDB struggles or saga. Some of the aspects that ended up feeding into the Bersih electoral protests, which also had to do with just rank corruption, a frustration of the lack of political finance legislation, and so forth. Perhaps the most I don't know, quirky twist in Malaysia has been a recent protest and counter protest in the very, very glitzy area of Bukit Damansara or Damansara Heights. These were protests that included names familiar to Malaysia watchers like Tony Fernandez, Khairi Jamaluddin, Nazir Razak, Ambiga Srinivasan, all as protesters against a mega development project, a pair of skyscrapers in their very Tony neighborhood, but also then protest against them for protesting to keep their area exclusive and pristine and not too developed when other areas of town occupied by less wealthy, less well-connected people have been developed with wild abandon. I think a lot of that also stems from just growing class awareness broadly in Malaysia and a shift both on the government side and in popular discourse away from speaking just in racial terms, which is the standard mode, has not disappeared. There still is a lot of that, but also overlaying over that this framing of like the B40, the M40, the T20, which echoes a way that the Philippines, for instance, has long addressed ways of segmenting the population, but is a somewhat new frame in Malaysia, and at least in terms of how much it's sticking. Third and finally, I think we see new modalities of protest that both facilitate mass protest and also demonstration or diffusion effects. And the latter are always very difficult to trace definitively. So this entails a range of online tools that are increasingly integrated with in-person engagement. So not just messaging for solidaristic purposes, but Instagram or TikTok clips from protests, from an on-the-ground presence, as well as the ability increasingly to coordinate and communicate threats in real time. That's not new in the region. We saw this, in people power, the early stages of being able to communicate, already in the mid 80s with fax machines and so forth, and then later with text messaging across the region of where to go, where not to go, and so forth. But that has all really dramatically increased and has been done in really novel ways, especially in Hong Kong, but also in Thailand and Myanmar and elsewhere. So we had some different variants on this, the Milk Tea Alliance being perhaps the most heavily studied one, which was a specifically transnational and online network. But what's really apparent now are ways of signaling presence. So protests at monumental sites like Thailand's Democracy Monument, solidarity activism, not just to voice support in front of an embassy, solidaristically, but specifically to project that back, to join with the protests on the ground and country. It is, as I noted, hard to track whether these near simultaneous protests over similar issues in Nepal, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so forth, for example, are fully independent or not. But it does seem likely, because of these platforms, that there's at least some degree of bandwagoning or of demonstration effects. These sorts of protests and these new technologies offer new ways of hedging also for activists who face constraints on their home turf. So, for Myanmar activists in exile, for instance, to really remain part of a domestic civil society, but from afar. A kind of interesting new twist on things like doxing are these new shaming campaigns being labeled lifestyle policing in the Philippines for those accused of profiting from graft and government contracts. These sorts of tactics, which really make use of online modalities, call out the ostentatious lifestyles of political dynasts, as well as government contractors and their families. So, for instance, juxtaposing images of flooded neighborhoods and luxury goods or trips, the price of shoes that some of these people will purchase versus the annual wages of the urban poor, and so forth. These are things that were not readily possible with earlier technologies of activism that rely both on having those modes and also having, extraordinarily online networked populations. So I'll conclude with just what's unlikely to change soon, which is I don't see this wave of protests as dying down anytime soon, even regardless of whether they have much concrete effect. And they do seem to be having some. But we are likely to see only further economic hardships with tariffs, already elevated inflation, uncertain production and trade patterns, and more. And the economic effects of the pandemic were among the key factors that really tipped off this latest wave of engagement. Second, we'll see, I think, still, and Prashanth in particular, and July will be able to say more to this, increasing, if continued or increasing global and regional tensions. So issues like the Thai-Cambodia border, which can prompt some, kind of nationalistic grandstanding and protest mobilization in either country internally, but also questions of Gaza. Yes, let's hope this ceasefire agreement, hostage return, and so forth sticks, but there's still a long way to go in terms of recognizing Palestinian rights. This is a huge issue across much of Southeast Asia. Already in Malaysia, we're seeing some restlessness over Donald Trump's upcoming trip there. So those sorts of geopolitical issues, I think, will remain especially fraught compared with prior periods, and will continue to prompt, a fairly unusual type of activism. We see it at periods, but it's not an ongoing thing of activism around foreign policy concerns. And then finally, longer term, this is a region that's especially vulnerable to climate change, such as with worsening typhoons that are already just so difficult in places like the Philippines. But flooding is just so huge an issue also in Malaysia and Singapore and elsewhere. Skewed resource use, which will increasingly affect domestic populations with the growth in data centers and AI, these technologies that are diverting so much potable water, other water, electricity, and so forth, that will likely increase costs for domestic consumers. And then also just, we've only begun to see the effects of constraints on migration to the US, to Europe, and elsewhere, and thus on the prospects for social mobility among these very networked, already frustrated younger Southeast Asians. So I'll stop there and turn it over to others.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Weiss, for your insights and expertise. That was very comprehensive. I'll now turn it over to Prashanth if you want to speak on the topic.
Great, thanks. So I think I maybe situate my remarks kind of where Meredith left off, which I think is the kind of intersection, but also sort of a split screen almost between foreign policy dynamics and domestic political dynamics, right? So I think on the one hand, in three of the countries which has received most of the attention on these protests that have been happening, so Indonesia, the Philippines, and Timor, all three are cases where I think I would argue there's been a lot more focus on the foreign policy and geopolitics and geoeconomics, but domestic politics in Southeast Asia has a way of continually reminding us that all politics is local. And I think that is definitely something we're seeing in all three of those cases. I think with Indonesia, particularly in Washington, there's a lot of focus about Prabowo as the sort of a jet-setting president, right? Somebody who has clocked, almost more miles than President Jokowi, his predecessor, did in two of his terms in just a year, right? So much so that some of his advisors don't even announce some of the stopovers because they're not sure if he's going to attach new trips to those midway. But I think the reality in Indonesia, my travels there, I was in Jakarta just a few months ago. The domestic economic climate is extremely worrying. You have recently a cabinet reshuffle, which saw the removal of one of their key ministers, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who's very globally recognized as being a great financial and economic manager. And there's a lot of uncertainty around, after two terms where there was a president and President Joko Widodo or President Jokowi, where there's a lot of demands within the region and globally for Indonesia to be more globally active, even though the domestic economic management was more of a focus. We're now seeing kind of a flip of that, right? A president who cares a lot about global engagement, is a very good orator, ex-military person, but the domestic economic management issues are very real. And it's extremely worrying where Indonesia is headed now. And you're seeing a lot of tensions around these populist policies that Prabowo has been trying to adopt, sort of free lunch programs, for example, lots of scandals around that. So I suspect, that kind of juxtaposition between this kind of jet-setting president externally, but also very real issues around housing allowances, how parliament is structured, the role of the military, civil military dynamics, is a huge issue. So when I was on my recent trips to Indonesia, just when Prabowo had been inaugurated, as we were trying to get through to see some of the officials in the foreign ministry, there were big questions around whether some of these ministries could even keep the lights on, right? Because there were a lot of issues and cuts with respect to these very basic issues. I would say in the Philippines, and I'm sure July will say a lot more about this, I think we're seeing the case where you've seen a number of officials. Kevin Rudd has sort of said this publicly as well, former Australian Prime Minister who watches US-China competition quite closely, that the Philippines is really the main battleground on US-China competition when you look at Southeast Asia. So there's a tendency to pay a lot of attention to, President Marcos was just in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. He's the only Southeast Asian leader to have visited the White House and navigated that sort of series of interactions with President Trump. But I recall when Marcos was here in Washington, D.C., he was paying a lot more attention to what was going on back home in the Philippines, because this was initially when you saw a lot of these sort of flood issues and corruption issues. In the Philippines, it tends to be a series of waves, but you already saw it sort of playing out. So he had to kind of navigate that sort of foreign domestic split screen that I was talking about from that perspective. And so the dynamic of Marcos, sort of having an outside game versus an inside game is something that, you see a lot of, right? If you look at the polling in the Philippines, Marcos is doing extremely well on the South China Sea, right? Where Filipinos they don't need to be told, right? Given what's been going on in the Philippines with respect to China, that this matters. These big geopolitical issues matter. Where Marcos does less well on is some of the big sort of economic issues that are much more domestic in nature. So I think you are seeing that. I also think, in my travels to Davao, for example, where I was there a few months ago, and all of us know this, when you get out of the capital cities in these Southeast Asian countries, the conversation looks very different from where it is in the capital cities, where a lot of elite concentration of power is. And so, depending on where you go in the Philippines, Marcos is perceived very differently in some of these domestic political dynamics and this kind of dynastic struggle that you have in some of these countries. The Philippines, it plays out, sort of more in the public domain, but in all of these other countries, you have that too, right? Prabowo, for example, is a long time sort of individual in the domestic landscape. And in all of these three countries, I would argue, you have a dynamic where I was just doing the math on this, right? So, you know, Zanana Guzmao in Timor is 79 years old. Prabowo is 74. Marcos is 68, right? These are leaders in their late 60s to 70s. The median age in Timor is 21. In Indonesia, it's 30, and in the Philippines, it's 25, right? So just a huge, vast difference and gap, not just in age, but in terms of the dynastic politics versus the populist sentiment that you see on the streets. And then I would just say quickly on Timor, I was there about a year ago, and when we were landing, the flight sort of coincided with sort of a huge celebrity arrival, and everyone was wondering what was going on. And it turns out that Manny Pacquiao was on the flight. That spoke less to how elaborate the flight was, but more because of the fact that you have so few flights going to Timor, right? It's not a very connected country. The airport is in a state of, it needs a lot more improvements. So a lot of conversation around Timor is focused around the enlargement of the ASEAN family. So ASEAN has had 10 countries for the better part of the last 3 decades since the first wave of expansion. Timor is going to officially become a member of ASEAN, a full member of ASEAN, when we see ASEAN convene its next round of summitry in Kuala Lumpur, which Meredith just referenced. So there's going to be a lot of focus on external dynamics and foreign policy. But in Timor, the issues are very much around cost of living, these sort of economic issues that are very much more basic. And Timorese leaders don't need to be told that this is the case, right? Jose Ramos Horta was a Nobel Prize laureate, one of the founding generational members in Timor. He was at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year in Singapore. And he told the audience that even though people talk a lot, foreign observers about Timor being part of ASEAN, and it ranks really well in terms of democracy in Southeast Asia because there are not a lot of good stories, in terms of the aggregate democracy metrics. He said very publicly at that engagement, he said, I would much rather be ranked as a leader on some of these economic indices, like, countering corruption or GDP growth rates, rather than being seen as, sort of this sort of democracy story. So I think the other thing that we should keep in mind as well is that I think the leaders and the elites in these countries recognize that there is this large foreign policy, domestic politics gap. And so you are seeing, I think, a lot of these instances where leaders will make overseas trips, but before they make the trip and after they make the trip, they try to justify to the population, why are you going? What are you doing for me? How much in terms of investment deals are you actually getting? How does that actually sort of manifest for people on the ground? And so you are seeing, I think, as you see this kind of foreign domestic politics sort of split screen, a lot more justification that is needed by these leaders to justify why are you not staying at home and resolving a lot of these big issues that we are facing? And also, what Meredith referenced, which is if there is a series of tariffs that are being imposed on these countries, what are you doing to get a better deal, not just for the elites, but for the population? How are you tying this in with these individual countries? And I would just kind of end by saying that at the risk of being too negative, right? Southeast Asia is a very positive story if you look at it relative to other parts of the world in the aggregate, right? So young population, you look at foreign direct investment. I work a lot with companies. they're doing a lot more in Southeast Asia. Foreign direct investment has doubled in the last 10 years. The aggregate sort of growth rates for Southeast Asia and ASEAN is about 5%. Some of the countries in the world would kill for that. But that doesn't mean at the same time that as you have this really good aggregate story, that some of these individual countries are not experiencing big issues and challenges. And the challenges are around the distribution of that aggregate sort of wealth and growth rates and so on and so forth. And that's what people actually care about. And these big gaps that you're seeing around elites versus the population, the big gaps that you're seeing in terms of open and closed societies and conversations are some things that, not just scholars and academics and people in the street care about, but companies care about that a lot, right? I would just end with the quick anecdote that in the middle of the Indonesia protests, you just saw actually a very temporary suspension of TikTok in Indonesia in exchange for some of the data conversations that were going around in Indonesia, and that was subsequently lifted. So I would say whether you're individuals, your scholars, or even companies, you have to think about these very local protests because those are going to ultimately matter a lot more than some of these big geopolitical conversations. Because one thing about Southeast Asia is if you don't pay attention to these individual protests, then you will end up being surprised by what people who watch the region more closely are not surprised by, like the election of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, like the election that we saw of the first election of the opposition in Malaysia in the country's history, which we saw following the 1MDB scandal. So I would just, foot stomp the idea that, we should be paying a lot more granular attention to these protests because you don't know how they're going to manifest in some of the upcoming local and general elections. And I would just say I was saying this a little bit earlier before we started, really commend the US Asia Institute for really spotlighting this dynamic rather than another webinar on just US China competition or some of these more global dynamics, because I think it's really important. So thanks a lot. Looking forward to the July's remarks and the rest of the discussion in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I'll now pass it over to our final speaker.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sharissa. Yes, following up on Meredith's presentation, she already mentioned about the Gen Z protests and the youth in Southeast Asia, and then Prashanth also already mentioned also the geopolitics and ASEAN and what's happening. So I'd like to focus more on democratization. If we notice, most of the countries that we are now discussing, Indonesia, Philippines, Timor-Leste, and more recently Malaysia, are the last of the democratizing Southeast Asian countries. No? As we all know, democracy, at least the Western liberal democratic variant, has not really found fertile ground in Southeast Asia. And now focusing on the Philippines takes pride in being the oldest liberal democracy, at least on paper, in the region. And what's happening in the Philippines is also gives us an idea of the trajectories or the different conjunctures that might happen in the succeeding days and months in the other parts of the region. And Philippines takes pride. It has a rich history of political mobilization and mass protest. It takes pride in mounting the very first people power uprising in 1986 that ousted the first Marcos dictatorship or the first Marcos presidency. But just like other countries in recent years and even in the past decade, uh, it has become a victim of democratic regression and backsliding. And we saw this with the election of the populist strongman Rodrigo Duterte, whose 6 years of not fully authoritarian, but of course, a very restrictive democratic space, ironically gave rise to authoritarian nostalgia that paved the way for the return of the Marcos family into power. So I've always mentioned using uh, Catholic biblical metaphors. No, the Dutertes are the John the Baptist that paved the way for the second coming of the Marcos dynasty. So they formed a uniteam alliance, no, a unity of political dynasties that became a formidable political machinery. And Ferdinand Marcos, ironically, on the 50th year anniversary of the declaration of martial law by his father, became president of the Philippines. And but of course, the unity of these two political dynasties, and of course, the Philippines is a land of dynasty in which 50 to 60% of all elected officials, national and locally, belong to a political dynasty. And the political dynasties in the Philippines are what we call fat political dynasties because they occupy practically all the elective positions in a particular constituency. So 3 years after, everybody was saying Ferdinand Marcos Jr. would end up like his father. But he turned out to be different because he emulated the early version of his father, the democratically elected Ferdinand Marcos, who was a cold warrior and uh, Cold Warrior and democratically elected and pro-US, no? And this is where he disagreed, no, with the Dutertes, and as we all know, the Dutertes pivoted to China, and there lies the geopolitical dynamic behind the split between these two political dynasties. And it has reached a point. We just concluded our midterm elections, and the coalition of the administration led by Ferdinand Marcos Jr. or Bongbong Marcos underperformed in the senatorial election. Plus, they pushed for the impeachment of the vice president. Vice president is the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, Sara Duterte, and they had a very public political divorce in which the vice president, Sara Duterte, even threatened to assassinate President Bongbong Marcos and the first lady and the speaker of the house, who happens to be the cousin of the president. Now, given all this political drama, um, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. needed a political win because he was losing control of the narrative. Lo and behold, in July, after a series of torrential rains and typhoons, he himself exposed all the corruption in the public work contracts with regard to infrastructure involving flood control programs. But this is not new. This has been the practice of all presidential administrations since the return of democracy. In fact, the joke was under the dictatorship, we had better infrastructure because there was only one thief at the top. When we democratized even the corruption. No? So everybody became corrupt, right? So actually, that was the issue. No, Marcos needed to score a political win over the Duterte. So he himself became a whistleblower and exposed all of this corruption. But Ferdinand Marcos thought that it's going to be a controlled burn politically. Little did he know that it's going to become, it's politically, it will have a life of its own. Because of his expose, because of him revealing all of this, people started pointing at the very political ally of the president. And it turns out that most of the political allies in Congress are either linked to the corrupt contractors or have become contractors themselves, and they've been dipping into the public funds. And the sheer amount is really mind-boggling by the billions. While a lot of people have lost their homes, have lost their lives because of the typhoons and the torrential rains and the floods, uh, people realize that a large chunk of the budget, billions of pesos, have been stolen, and none of the public work infrastructure projects have been built. So this has been labeled by the press as ghost projects. Plus, of course, the children of these corrupt politicians and contractors started showing off their wealth in social media, and that added to the anger. But what's interesting in this wave of protests is that during the time of Duterte and the early part of Ferdinand Marcos, people who used to be active, sectors like the middle class, uh, institutions like the Roman Catholic Church, which used to voice opposition to all of these shenanigans in politics and government, have actually been demobilized because of Duterte's war on drugs. But now, since Bongbong Marcos was different from Duterte, under Marcos, the democratic space uh, opened up a little. And this paved the way for these sectors, the middle class, the church, the universities, the academia, all of these sectors to finally find their voice again and found the courage to organize again and march in the streets of Manila. And this is something that the Marcos administration cannot control because this is, in my mind, the reawakening of people power. Something that we started, something that my generation started. I was part of that generation that marched against the Marcos dictatorship, and we were at EDSA during the People Power Uprising. And this is a big development in the Philippines because the Gen Z are the largest uh, voting population, and they're the largest demographics in terms of political support. The millennials are now running the country, and yet the millennials have become pessimistic and dissatisfied with democracy. The Gen Zs can either swing as dissatisfied Democrats or dissatisfied authoritarians. It depends on how this administration will uh, play its card. But there's another danger. The Duterte faction of the political clans are really pressuring the military and its ally to destabilize the Marcos Jr. administration for the simple reason that if they succeed in ousting through extra constitutional or extra legal means Bongbong Marcos, the constitutional successor is Vice President Sara Duterte. And they are pressed for time because Bongbong Marcos allowed the arrests of the old man Duterte, who's now waiting trial for crimes against humanity at The Hague. No? So this is really similar to the situation we had in 1986. We can identify the different factions struggling for uh, for a strategic position to outdo each other. We're seeing this is like a really a real life Game of Thrones, no? And we're seeing the movements and the tactics and the intent of the especially the two big political dynasties because it has become an existential political battle between the two of them. It's either they get rid of one another before the next round of the presidential election in 2028, or else, the Marcos might end up in exile again, or if the old man Duterte is found guilty, or if he dies in the Netherlands, then that signals the end of the Duterte power. So who knows what will happen next? There are now rumors of who attempts again, something that we haven't heard since the mid 80s and the 90s. And it's going to be a test uh, of our institutions post 1986, since the restoration of formal liberal democracy. The military has become very professional, and the military has its own set of problems other than domestic destabilization because of course, the West Philippine Sea. So there will be another series of big demonstration and rallies. One on October 12th to be organized by the Duterte forces. And I think they're going to make another push for a people power withdrawal of support from the military, and they will try to grab power by October 12th. And the other one is the November 30 uh, mass demonstration to be organized by the liberal, progressive, civil society, people power organization. So that's the latest from the Philippines. Still a lot will happen in the coming days and weeks and months. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you to all of our speakers for your remarks. If anyone has any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat, but I'll turn it over to Prashanth to direct some questions, ask some of your own, and just facilitate a conversation.
Yeah.
Great, awesome, thanks. So I wanted to ask both of you, because we talked a little bit of both in your remarks about how the protesters and those movements are adapting and adjusting to change.
Right.
I'm wondering on the flip side, whether you're seeing any changes or
Mhm.
mostly more continuity in terms of how governments are adjusting to that, and whether you're seeing changing strategies, adaptation in this early stages that you find really interesting. Maybe we'll start with Meredith and then we'll go to
Yeah.
John.
I mean, I do think that there's been some level of adaptation or address. So we see this in statements by different governments in the region that they'll at least look into these concerns. In other words, they're not dismissing them. They're not saying these are anti-national or inappropriate. It's not that they're necessarily meeting these concerns nonviolently and placidly. I mean, we see that in Indonesia. But even as the police, for instance, crack down quite aggressively in Indonesia, on arguably stepping up the timbre of some of the protests. So others seem to have stepped up that timbre independently. Um, they still also said, okay, we'll rethink what we're doing, and perhaps be a little bit more careful in how we talk about things like allowances and contracts and so forth. So I think to some extent that's a shift, and signals the fact that it's always going to be the case that most people don't take to the streets, but the extent to which at least a critical mass do also means that those claims are magnified many times over on social media and elsewhere. And so I do think that we might see some greater response to protests moving forward, especially around some of these issues of socioeconomic inequality, which are so pervasive and can be really destabilizing to regimes, especially in an era in which there's been such an anti-incumbent wave because of precisely those sorts of issues.
July?
Okay. So when Bongbong Marcos, when Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Exposed all of these, no, during his State of the Nation address, no, he actually said something, no, mahiya naman kayo. Have you no shame, no? Addressing the congressmen who are corrupt,
Mhm.
no? Have you no shame? Mahiya naman kayo. About the fact that they have stolen billions of pesos
Mhm.
of public money. That is what I call performative irony. I mean, because coming from a
Mhm.
Marcos, of course, his father was listed by the Guinness Book of World Record as one of the most corrupt presidents in the world, right? So coming from a
Yes.
Marcos and saying, "Have you no shame?" No, that was really something, no. And then on the day of the September 21 protest, National Day of Protest, which is also a historic irony because September 21 was the father declared martial law. So on the 53rd anniversary of the declaration of martial law that ended democracy under his father, uh, he actually said, if I wasn't president, I'll be right there marching with you. And all of us are saying, "What?" And you have to show them your anger that they have stolen from you. Again, what? I mean, here is a family that up to now has denied that they have taken money from the Filipino people. They have denied all the crimes that the Marcos
Mhm.
dictatorship has committed in its 14 years in power, has not returned a single peso, and yet he is, trying to change his image and change his narrative and become a reformist, an anti-corruption crusader, right? But
Mhm.
nonetheless, between him and the Dutertes, who are not only corrupt but also killers, right? So uh, the ordinary folks, the middle class, and the other sectors have no choice. Definitely, if we call for the resignation of Bongbong Marcos, that will mean the ascension of Duterte. And Duterte 2.0 could be much worse than having Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Mhm.
continue to complete his term in office, because that will mean in terms
Mhm.
of China. So we we are caught in system. It's only about corruption, but changing the way we do politics in this
Mhm.
country. And Meredith would know that we are really entrapped in this patronage democracy, in this clientelistic web. It's the
Mhm.
dynasty and it's the inequality that's causing all of these
Mhm.
problems for
Mhm.
us.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions. I see also one in the chat, which, I wonder what you both think.
Okay.
Any chance Papua New Guinea joins Timor as a new ASEAN member? I'll just say, from my own perspective, given how long it took Timor to join ASEAN, I see that as kind of a far off thing. It's something that's
Yeah.
been on the agenda primarily because of factors like, Indonesia clearly has a stake in that. But
Hmm.
I wonder if you two have any reactions on that issue or topic.
Well, for myself, I would agree. I mean, it's not beyond the pale, but it will have a long lead of advance notice if that's going to happen. And as of now, I haven't heard anything about really concrete steps, on the level of those towards including Timor-Leste, which in many ways was kind of more within the pale from an earlier stage, I think.
July, anything to add?
Sorry, I did not get the last part of your question.
No worries. The question
Okay.
in the chat about now that Timor is going to be joining ASEAN, but what about
Okay.
Papua New Guinea, which has always been
Well,
seen as the other potential
the other
sort of
potential,
candidate
right?
coming in to expand ASEAN?
Yeah. I'm not aware of any
Mhm.
plans for
Um,
that.
So one other question I wanted to get to both of you is, I mean, we've seen a number of countries in the region be in focus with this new wave of protests.
Yeah.
But
Right.
how do we think about the notion of this kind of spilling over or sort of the
Mhm.
sort of cross border or
Right.
whatever we want to call it, spillover or
Yeah.
whatever
Right.
you want to
Yeah.
use.
Right.
And how should we think about the dynamics that are country specific and those that are a little bit more in terms of what the region has in common? I know both of you addressed that somewhat in your remarks, but perhaps we
Mhm.
could just try to look
Right.
a little bit more at the
Right.
future prospects that we see in the coming months.
May I?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
you know, okay. Well, of course, earlier on, we saw the same thing happened in Hong Kong with the umbrella movement, and then it crossed over to form the Milk Tea
Mhm.
Alliance with, of course, Thailand and Myanmar and the other countries as well. I think the some youth groups in the Philippines were also involved in the Milk Tea Alliance, but it was a loose alliance, and they really did not have a grand policy or vision for the region or for democracy and that. So it's just a it's some sort of a political social club, and then eventually it disappeared, right? But this time it's different. Uh, we're seeing the symbolisms, and Mary did touch on this because of course, the influence of social media and all the pop culture behind it. No, the K-pop, the BL, and all these other. So it's interesting because w- from a Gen Z perspective, it's a non-political way of being political, right? Because it's very Gen Z to avoid politics at all costs, right? They're not really interested. Like in the Philippines, the Gen Z were born after all the political dramas. No, so they are not aware of what happened. Same thing can be said about Indonesia, right? And even and the other countries. No, the Gen Z are political tabula rasa, but their political attitudes and their political values are shaped primarily by their experience, particularly during the pandemic,
Mhm.
and by social media. And the way they react is quite different from the millennials, especially in the Philippines. The millennials saw the tail end of the democratization transition, the democratization process in the Philippines. And why
Mhm.
are they disappointed? Why are they angry? Because democracy failed to deliver. Democracy in the Philippines failed to deliver us to the promised land of development. So if they go to Singapore, they go to Malaysia, they say, oh, look at Malaysia, look at Singapore. They developed under authoritarianism, right?
Mhm.
So there lies the dissatisfaction of the millennials. So uh, these are the values shaping the youth protests in the Philippines. No, they can either
Mhm.
become dissatisfied Democrats, but Democrats nonetheless, or they become dissatisfied authoritarians or would be satisfied authoritarians. Right.
Mhm.
So that's the trick. That's the puzzle in the Philippines.
I think
Meredith, yeah.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that, although I do think sometimes the claims of Gen Z's apolitical aspect or lack of interest in politics can be overstated, especially if we understand politics to mean more
Right.
than elected leadership, which I think is part of the issue here is a recognition that political empowerment in increasingly constrained formal political environments may spill over into other ways, which actually may signal a greater sense of agency and claiming political space than simply voting.
Yeah.
That said, there are
Yeah.
plenty who are apathetic. At the same time as we see, protesters who have these sort of self-deprecating, what Anissa Beta calls jocular visuals, these sort of mocking their own presumed apathy, especially young women, for instance, who
Mm.
have all along been assumed, oh, you're not going to be political, and indeed, what do you know? Many are, in their signage as a way of grabbing attention. But the only thing I'll add is that, one thing that has facilitated transnational solidarity activism or that's motivated it globally in the past has been what's generally termed boomerang activism. It's a term from Keck and Sikkink. And it's about ways in which activists in fairly constrained political contexts may seek support from fellow activists in more open political contexts. So activists in China who can't lobby their own state directly for advocacy goals but can ask activists in the US or in Europe or wherever else to lobby their states to lobby the Chinese state. That, I think, is a very shrinking space at present. So, how many countries among the purported industrial liberal democracies are going to spend political capital trying to push human rights claims, for instance, vis-a-vis the more repressive states in Southeast Asia, or back up these sort of anti-inequality, anti-corruption protests, if part of the spur for that is specifically some of the economic pressure that's emerging from those advanced industrial democracies, not least the US. So I think that will shift the timbre and nature of this transnational side of protest activism and probably reinforce further the intra-Asian part of it, not just in terms
Okay.
of tropes and memes and so forth, which we are definitely
Yeah.
seeing, but also the actual networks, which, there's a long history of work. Penn Anderson wrote on this, Jeff Wasserstrom has a new book on this and so forth, about the concrete personal networks, people like Joshua Wong
Mm.
and Netiwit and so
Mhm.
forth, who have, made the Milk Tea Alliance, for instance, not just an online platform, but something that's grounded in actual
Mm.
humans and
Mm.
interactions. I think an increasing shift toward pursuing higher ed within the Asia Pacific rather than in places like the US could help to reinforce that further.
Right.
If there are further attacks on Taiwan, knowing how significant Taiwan is as a hub for young people across
Yeah.
generations, some of them no longer young in Southeast Asia,
Mm,
especially ethnic Chinese, to travel for higher ed.
mm,
I think that those sorts of things could really help to, again, shift kind of the fulcrum of some of that transnational activism and solidarity activism to be much more Asia rooted, which could make it more effective just because then there's an ASEAN landscape as well, which includes
mm.
not just the formal third track, but also the People's Assembly side of ASEAN as well.
Great. And I think I don't know if we have time to take a couple more questions, Charissa. I think we're almost out of time, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think we can take maybe like one more question.
One more.
Okay, so
Sure.
let's
Okay.
Okay.
maybe I'll sort of merge the two that we see in the
Mhm.
chat, and then either of you or both of you can take these in combination or separately. One is the question of global democratic backsliding. How does that kind
Hmm.
of factor into the region as well as the global landscape? I think both of you have talked to that to some degree, and then also this new wave of protests and activism. How likely are they to translate into wider institutional change as opposed to narrow policy concessions? And
Mhm.
one thing I'll say for myself is it's been really interesting to see how the demands of the protesters have actually been quite specific, right? It's not just about big, grand sort of,
Mhm.
because those issues have been long kind of there.
Right.
I think it's
Mhm.
Right.
really interesting to see tactically a focus on like, why
Right.
is this allowance specifically given or why?
Right.
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 Because you can actually get a lot more concessions on that one
Yeah.
thing. And then the other thing I'll say before I turn it to both of you and then we'll close is as we're talking about protests in the region, important to keep in mind that there are these other crossover dynamics as well, right? That are not in terms of protests, right?
Mhm.
Myanmar
Mm,
is going to have by all accounts, not
Yeah.
a very democratic election, in the
mm,
coming months.
Mhm.
We have Vietnam was going to have a party congress next year. That's not a
mm,
protest, but it's going to be a major indicator of what's happening. And then in Thailand,
Mhm.
obviously, we have a new government and we're going to have a new
mm.
election, but the progressive forces are the ones that
Mhm.
are not actually been included in the political process. So I do think the protests that we're seeing are actually, yes, there's a lot of questions about them, but they're actually a healthy manifestation or a healthier
Yeah.
manifestation of things that are happening. So maybe we can
Mhm.
start Meredith and then July, and then I'll turn it over to Sharissa to close us out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be as brief as I can. And I think actually Prashanth's comment on the specificity of advocacy claims is really salient here. So the fears of democratic backsliding in the region, those are real fears grounded in real backsliding, not in all countries, but in many, or in just the failure of reform promises. So we see that, for instance, in
Right.
Malaysia. At the same time, concretizing what individuals see as most problematic in that really helps to clarify how the ordinary person, citizens, activists, and so forth understand and experience what we might gloss as backsliding. And that allows, in terms of the second question, different types of change, which may take the form of wide sweeping institutional change, but that's harder to translate into actually meeting those demands. So things like electoral rules, yeah, that can matter a lot for addressing things like clientelism, but it's not an automatic process and it may backslide or it may backfire. So if, for instance, activists are saying, look, part of the problem is that there's an incentive to go into politics to get rich because of these forms of contracts and allowances and so forth, or that the reason that these allowances are needed is to make small patronage payouts. That's the problem. Then those sorts of adjustments and respond in response to specific advocacy efforts can ultimately help to reshape institutional politics. So it's not a given, but I do think we're seeing at least some movement in that direction. And I agree that it's not an unhealthy shift if activists who feel, or just ordinary citizens who feel that their vote is diluted or is not diluted, not diluted, or is not having the effect they might hope, that they instead turn to forms of other forms of politics. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and it may help to ensure that the states that want to keep politics within the formal political electoral arena make changes to ensure that votes matter more.
July?
Thank you. Um, I'll just keep my comments very short and personal. As someone who has been a young activist once upon a time, not so long ago, and someone who has lived through two strongmen presidents, no? seeing young people march again in the streets of Manila and the rest of the Philippines, and seeing the same phenomenon all over the region, young people demanding change, hope, justice, and democracy, then we can say that there is a big hope for democracy still, and this is a big, very big pushback to the anti-democratic populist wave that we have experienced in the
Mhm.
past decade. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to all of our speakers, especially for ending on a hopeful note. That concludes our Southeast Asia in Focus webinar. I want to thank again all of our panelists for taking the time to share their expertise today. And thank you to the audience for your attention. We will upload the video recording onto our YouTube. And if you would like to continue following the Institute's work and programming, you can sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter, the Asia News Brief, which will be linked in the chat, I think. And alternatively, you can find us on our website. So thank you everyone again for participating and have a great long weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Bye.